Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Winenance Wednesday. This is our weekly financial independence live stream show and podcast where we talk to you about all the ways that we can transform our lives through our finances. We do that by learning how to spend our money more intentionally, how to grow and invest our money, and of course, how to live more fulfilling, more meaningful lives. We are your hosts and personal finance educators, Stephanie and Marie. We are also two sisters on the path to financial independence. And this week we have a really interesting show for you. It's very timely. But before we get into all of that, we wanted to briefly touch base on our workshop that we held last week. So last week we had our very first Winenance workshop. It was called Building Wealth in Your 401k. And I think it was, well, first I want to thank everyone who did attend the workshop and thank you for all of the great feedback that you've provided to us. We were so excited to see how everybody responded to all of the information, how engaged they were during the workshop. One of our participants, she even reached out and said that, well, first off, she was so just impressed with all the information, but she said that she finally had a roadmap for how to invest in her 401k. And immediately following the workshop, she started making changes in her 401k because she felt confident about what she was investing in. She knew how to invest in her 401k. So, that was very exciting. And if you were not able to join last week, that's okay. We're actually going to be having more workshops. This is just the first of many to come. We will announce dates very soon. If you do want to be alerted when we do announce our next round of workshops, go ahead and go to winancefi.com and subscribe to our email list. When you're there, you'll actually get our free guide, our free 401k guide. And that is actually the guide that you'll need to go through our building wealth with 401ks. So definitely go to our email list and sign up today so you can be notified when we do launch our next round of workshops. All right. So as I mentioned, we have a really robust agenda for you tonight. So we are actually going to skip over drink of the week, but I'll just let you know I'm drinking seltzer tonight because this is a topic. Water for Stephanie. This is a topic you're going to probably want a notepad for. You're going to want to take a lot of notes. It was such a big topic that we ended up having to decide to split it up into two different parts. So we're talking about HSAs versus PPOs because it's open enrollment season right now. And it's going to be an interesting or like a new format for us tonight because I'm actually going to be interviewing Stephanie, who she and her husband both chose to do HSAs for themselves. So I wanted to learn more about why Stephanie made this decision and what this actually means for her finances, because I don't know if you guys know, but an HSA account is an investment account and you can use it to help grow wealth.
Yep.
So we are very interested in learning all about that. So, Steph, what do you think? Should we dive on in?
Let's dive in because it's a lot to go over.
It is a lot to go over. All right. So, well, first things first, what the heck is an HSA?
So first, let's talk about what HSA stands for. HSA is a health savings account, and it's basically exactly what it sounds like. It is a tax advantage savings account for people with high deductible healthcare plans. So when we say tax advantage, hopefully we all know what that means at this point, either getting tax advantage in the beginning when you're pre-tax contributions or tax advantage at the end, like a Roth IRA, when you're no tax through your growth and when you deduct. The HSA is triple tax advantage, which is why people in the FI and the FIRE community love it so much because it is tax-free all the way through so long as you follow all the rules. So you can have tax-free contributions, tax-free growth, and tax-free withdrawals. Basically, the true meaning and traditional purpose of a HSA is it allows you to make contributions to this tax-free account and save money on your future medical expenses. So when you have a high deductible plan, that means you have to pay off your deductible first through your healthcare expenses before your insurance will start covering or kick in. And so that's the whole point, is that you're stocking this money away in this advantaged account, this tax advantaged account. Hopefully you're investing it and having some growth on it. And then that way you can use it for your future medical expenses. So that's kind of it in the crux. And one of the things I thought was interesting, so an HSA is not a new thing and it's been around for God knows how long, years and years and years. And a lot of people have participated in them before. And so I was curious to know how many people in our community have participated in HSAs before. So instead of having a question of the day today, we did a poll on Instagram and Facebook, and we polled our community to see how many had participated in HSAs. And so what we found out is people who follow Winenance, 64% of the people have participated in HSA in the past and 36% haven't. And I think that's really interesting because actually, if you were to poll, a wider swath of people who don't follow Winenance or are not part of the FI community, you might find out that it's actually far lower, that only about 25% of people actually participate in HSAs, and even fewer, only 15% of that 25% use it as an investment account or invest in their HSA. So I thought it was awesome that a large majority of our community is already participating in an HSA. I didn't ask how many were actually using it as an investment account, but I have to assume that people who are actually contributing to it at this point hopefully really are. So if you aren't yet, continue watching and you'll find out why it's an awesome account, and definitely stick around for part 2, which is coming up in a few more weeks. And that's really when you're going to learn all the hacks about an HSA.
Well, that is really interesting. And I have to say, I get a little bit confused about like understanding an HSA because it's health care, health insurance, health savings accounts, but it's also an investment account. And so I imagine that a lot of people probably get sort of very confused around what an HSA actually is and why they're being given this option as opposed to a PPO option through their employer. And to your point about the stats you were saying, I could see why probably a lot of people end up going with the PPO, maybe feeling like it's the safer, like less risky option. Also, maybe just a little less confusing too. I think for most people, they can kind of understand PPO is insurance. You pay a premium, you pay a deductible. You might have to pay a copay, but with an HSA, it's a little bit different. So I know you're going to get into all of that in a little bit, but let's talk more about who can actually contribute to an HSA.
Right. So I think it's good to start at the beginning. And, obviously we're going to talk about what an HSA and all the benefits of it, but it's important to know whether this is actually something that might apply to you. So there's a lot of rules around HSAs because there are so many tax advantages to it. So the IRS has, stipulated all these various rules that go around who can contribute to an HSA. And it's important to make the distinction between have an HSA and contribute. Anyone in the world can open up an HSA, but actually making contributions to it is what the rules are for. So the first rule, and the number one rule to understand, is that according to IRS guidelines, you can contribute to an HSA if you are covered under a qualifying high deductible healthcare plan. And we'll go into the next section about what that actually means and the details of it, but that's the first rule. So if you don't have a high deductible healthcare plan, then the rest of the rules don't really apply. The next one is whether you are covered under other medical insurance. So if your spouse has insurance that you're currently covered under, you couldn't open an HSA on your own. You would have to have completely separate insurance and not have access to your spouse's insurance. The next part is if you're covered under Medicare or TRICARE, which is for armed services, uniformed armed services, or under medical care for from the VA, you would not qualify. Or if you can be claimed as somebody else's dependent on their tax return, such as if you're still young and on your parents' tax return, you couldn't qualify for an HSA. And then last is if you are qualified for an FSA or HRA, which is a flexible spending account or a health reimbursement account. And so my employer actually just last year was the first year that we had a plan that qualified, even though technically our plan was a high deductible plan. My employer always had an HRA, which is a health reimbursement account, which is where they provide you a set amount towards your deductible at the beginning of the year. And you can pull from that, basically it's like first in, first out. So like if you have expenses at the beginning of the year, all that money is going to come from your employer technically because they've already funded your HRA. Whereas an HSA is a savings account, which means you're putting that money in periodically over your paycheck. And then your employer may choose to fund it in the beginning of the year or with each paycheck. So those are kind of the stipulations. So, and there are some other detailed rules. So certainly if you're interested in applying or contributing to an HSA, look through all the details. They're all available online on the IRS website. And it's actually pretty easy to understand on the IRS website. So feel free to go there to look through more details of it, but those are the kind of basic rules. And like I said, the first thing is whether you have a high deductible healthcare plan.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So the next,
add something.
yeah. So I wanted to go into what the high deductible healthcare plan is, because that's the other part that can be kind of confusing. So we have another slide for that. So a high deductible healthcare plan, and there's a difference between individuals and family. And I think that's kind of the point we want to make here, because you're going to see this frequently throughout these slides. So an individual is just what it sounds like. It's just you. It's only you on your healthcare plan, no spouse, no children, no other dependents on your plan. Family is just you and at least one additional person. So it can be you and your spouse, you and a child, you and your whole entire family. As long as they're dependents on your healthcare plan, you're considered at the family level. So for individuals, your minimum deductible for a high deductible healthcare plan is $1,400. For families, it's $2,800. And then your out-of-pocket maximum, which is the most amount of money that you would have to pay out of pocket, even with your insurance. For 2020, for individuals, it's $6,900. For 2021, it's $7,000. And for families, it would be $13,800 and $14,000 for 2021. And those out-of-pocket maximums are the parts you really need to focus on as well, because that's a significant amount of money. I mean, we would be covered under the family plan because it's me and my spouse and my child. And $14,000 for next year is a ton of money if potentially we had some major issues. So those are the things you really want to consider, not just that your deductible is only $2,800 or your deductible is only $1,400, but your maximum out of pocket could be significantly more. So you definitely want to pay attention to those areas, because it's very important when you're determining whether a high deductible healthcare plan with an HSA would be good for your situation.
Okay. All right. So there are obviously limits, just like even with a regular insurance plan, a PPO. So that's good to know. So you can't, you couldn't be billed for, hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. There are restrictions. So that's good. I mean, that might actually make some people feel a little bit more comfortable about, potentially going with the HSA option. So you've been talking about contribution. So how much can you actually contribute to an HSA?
Right. So again, with it being a tax advantage account, the IRS kind of treats it similar to IRAs and 401ks, where there's contribution limits. And each year, this amount will potentially increase or potentially decrease. But I think as far as I've seen it for history, it's only increased because it usually goes with inflation. So it goes up, a little bit each year. And so for 2020, the individual contribution maximum is $3,550. And for 2021, that's increased by only $50 to $3,600. But for families, it's double that. So as a family, which means just you and at least one other person on your healthcare plan, for 2020, you can contribute $7,100, and for 2021, it's $7,200, so an extra $100. But the other awesome thing, similar to 401ks and IRAs, is that there is a catch-up contribution for people above a certain age. So if you are age 55 or older, you have an additional $1,000 that you can put as a catch-up contribution, and that applies whether you have an individual plan or a family plan. And again, remember when you say individual and family, that's for your health care, not necessarily HSA. So those contribution limits is where it really comes into play, whether you have a family plan or an individual plan. So if it was just myself on my insurance, I would only be able to contribute up to that maximum, that $3,550 for 2020 or $3,600 for next year for 2021. But for our entire family, meaning me and my spouse and my child, we can contribute to that $7,100 or $7,200 for next year. So it's really important to know what these maximums are. I think it's a great advantage, because think about it that way. That's additional money that is deducted from your taxable income. So we're talking here about health savings, and all this money is going towards future healthcare expenses. So your co-pays, your deductibles, medications, whatever it is that applies and that's eligible under an HSA as an eligible expense, all this is going to those future expenses. But it's also tax advantage, which means that it's decreasing your taxable income today, which is part of the amazing thing. So if I'm maxing out my HSA at $7,100, that's decreasing my taxable income this year by $7,100, $7,000. And that's an awesome amount of money to be saving.
And then that's in addition to what you might be contributing to an IRA or to a 401k or another employer-sponsored retirement account. So really, you have the potential to lower your taxable income by a significantly more than
Oh,
you would
yeah.
if you didn't have an HSA.
Absolutely. And people in the financial independence community and FIRE community have kind of known these hacks, if you want to call it that, for a while. It's just basically knowing the rules of all these things. But you could max out your 401k at 19,500 and max out a traditional IRA at 6,000 and max out a dependent care account, which is a whole nother thing, at 5,000, and then max out an HSA at 7,100 for a family plan. And that's well over $40,000-$50,000 at that point. So that's a truly an amazing amount of money to be able to deduct from your income taxes and be able to save on. Now, keep in mind that obviously in the future, you may be spending money for taxes for, your traditional 401k and your traditional IRA and things like that. But today you are saving your taxes. And as long as you can plan for the future, then it gives you time to figure out what you might do, in the years to come when you may potentially have to pay income tax on that amount.
I think that's what's really interesting about this. And I know you're going to talk a little bit about this in a moment, but the fact that this can be leveraged as a wealth building tool, not just, for health expenses or just for healthcare, is that opportunity to use it as a hack, an investment hack. And I know we're going to talk in much more detail about that in part 2 of this series on HSAs. But why don't you walk us through about employer contributions, because this is essentially functioning like an employer-sponsored retirement account, in which case most employers do offer some kind of match, with a 401k. So is that the case with HSAs? Can employers contribute to an HSA?
Yeah, so employers can contribute. Not all do, but a lot of employers who offer a high deductible plan with an HSA do also contribute or have some kind of a match. And I think that's one of the fantastic things about an HSA. So similar, like you mentioned, with a 401k or a 403b, other employer-sponsored retirement plans, employers will kind of incentivize their employees to participate in these plans by offering some kind of a match or contribution to the account. And that's the other great thing, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be an exact match. It can sometimes be a dollar for dollar match. So like for my husband's case, his employer will cover a dollar to dollar match for the family plan up to $780. So long as my husband contributes $780 to his HSA, his employer will also contribute $780. If he only contributed $500, his employer would only contribute $500.
Sure.
Whereas my employer does a direct contribution. So as long as I participate in my HSA, they will give a direct contribution. I think it was $800 for independent. I forget how much it was for family, because I'm only on my own plan. It's just me on my plan, so I'm an individual. But again, I don't have to contribute anything if I didn't want to. I did choose to, just to split it up, but I didn't have to contribute anything if I really didn't want to. So I thought that was an awesome thing. And actually, one of the even more amazing things, I just saw someone had posted in one of the FI groups on Facebook that their employer this year was contributing up to the max to their HSAs. So can you imagine your employer basically just saying, okay, Marie, here's an extra $7,100 towards your HSA.
Wow.
If you were on the family plan. And the way that you have to kind of think about it is that that's an employee benefit. That's literally free money. It's not money you have to pay tax on, because it's tax-free contributions, and you write it off. You get to write that amount off. So you're getting that advantage of that. And you don't have to pay taxes on that money when you're pulling out, so long as you use it for eligible medical expenses, which we'll get into the details of that as well too in the next section. But I mean, that's an amazing thing. That's literally $7,000 or over $7,000 from your employer, completely free. And the great thing about it is that you can invest that money. It doesn't just have to be $7,000. If you save that money, it could be $10,000 or $20,000 in the future. It depends on how the market does. But it's just such an opportunity to have that many people don't really realize. And I think that's one of the things, is that HSAs can be really confusing to people. There's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of math involved. There's a lot of like, well, what if this situation kind of happens? Because like you said, this is health insurance. It's not just a retirement account like a 401k or a 403b. You're also talking about your health insurance. So there's a lot of factors to consider in this. But if you run the numbers and figure out that, okay, this could possibly work for me, it really is a great opportunity. And that's why we really want to do this episode tonight, because we wanted people to understand, like, don't be afraid of the numbers. Don't be afraid of doing the math. It's not as difficult as it might seem. And it can be an awesome opportunity for you.
Wow. I mean, that really is amazing. And I have to say, a lot of benefits administrators at your job, at your employers, they'll briefly maybe walk you through these are the two types of plans that you have available, but they don't necessarily break this information down for you. And they certainly aren't breaking it down in a manner that helps you actually decide, is this the right option for myself and my family or not? I know at my job, we do have the option for an HSA with a high deductible plan or a PPO. And I know you're going to talk to us a little bit more about your decision-making process, but short of there was sort of like they had three scenarios, this is Jane and she's single and this is why she chose to do it. And this is Mary and Jim and they've got 3 kids and this is why they chose to go the PPO route. But outside of sort of those very basic simulations that don't necessarily fully apply to everyone, it is hard to kind of figure that out for yourself, if this is the right choice. But before we get into that, I did want to ask you about the HSA being used as an investment tool. And I know you've talked about, like, in the financial independence community, the Mad Scientist has a really well-known blog post about how an HSA is considered the ultimate retirement account, or the secret tool, if you will, to retirement accounts. So can you talk to us a little bit more about that and why that is?
Yeah, so kind of like I mentioned, when you're contributing to an HSA, it is a triple tax advantage account. And we actually have a really good graphic for this. So when you make your contributions are tax deductible, which means they're pre-taxed or tax-free. Whether you do it through your employer or on your own, they're going to be tax-free. And actually, it's more advantageous to contribute through your payroll, through your employer, because you get an additional 7.65% FICA tax savings. So when you contribute directly, you can write that off through when you do your income tax return the following year, but you don't get that 7.65% FICA tax included. But when you contribute through your payroll, you do. So if you can contribute through your employer, that's definitely the more advantageous way to go. So once you make your contributions, all that money you can either put into a cash account where it just sits there available for you until you need to use it. If you have some medical expenses that are immediate and you need that money immediately, you can pull that money from there. Or sometimes people will give you an opportunity to put it in an investment account. And if you put it into an investment account, you can choose options like a total stock market index fund or a, international index fund or bonds, or there's usually a good selection of options, not always the best, but usually a good selection of options for investment types. And you can put it into those different funds and let it grow, and it's growing tax-free. So you're not paying money on dividends during that time. You're not paying money on any gains or earnings. So it all grows tax-free. And then the last part, which is the most amazing part of it, because there's no other account out here like it, is that when you go to pull that money out, when you're saying, okay, I have this big medical expense coming up, I have a surgery or whatever it might be, and I need to pay for it, is so long as you have that eligible expense, you can pull that money out tax-free. And that's the part that blows everybody's mind, because literally you can wait decades. So long as the IRS doesn't change their rules, which as of now, knock on wood, they aren't. And it's important to kind of keep track of these rules. But as of now, literally, if 10 years ago, I contributed to an HSA, I contributed all that money, and I now have 10 years of growth, and say I've been maxing it out year over year, and now it's worth $50,000 or whatever, which is a significant amount of money over 10 years. But if now all of a sudden I have to have some major surgery and it's going to be $6,000 out of pocket, so long as I have that money in the account, I can either pull that money out now from my investment account or from my cash account, whatever's available there, or I can wait another 10 years, let it grow for 20 years total. And then in another 10 years, I hopefully have 10 years more worth of growth on there. It's now grown to $80,000 or $100,000. And I can say, okay, now I'm going to reimburse myself for that $6,000 expense. And so that's the amazing part that people don't realize, is that you don't have to reimburse yourself immediately from your HSA. You can hold on to those receipts. So it can be a receipt that proves what the expense is. It can be an explanation of benefits or EOB from your insurance company that details what you had, who the provider was. I mean, there's really some basic information that you want to have on there. The date of service, because you need to make sure that the eligible event was after you established your HSA. So if you establish your HSA today, your eligible expenses would need to be from today's date through on. So, November, December of next year, whatever, but not September of 2020. Like I couldn't establish it today and then reimburse myself from September because it was in the past. So that's the first thing. But your date of service, what you had done, and it doesn't have to be the detail of like, well, I had this mole removed, but as long as you show that it's from like a doctor's office, it was a copay, it was part of your deductible, it was a prescription that you had filled at XYZ pharmacy, or even some certain things like similar to FSAs. Certain over-the-counter things will be covered through there. So I'm trying to think, like eyeglasses. If you have prescription eyeglasses, those will be covered throug't your HSA. Dental work, in some cases, can be covered through your HSA. A lot of other vision things, certain medications, obviously prescription coverages will be, prescription copays and whatnot will be covered through your HSA, but also certain over-the-counter medications can be covered as well through your HSA. Almost line for line, whatever's covered under your FSA will typically be covered under your HSA. So there is a good amount of eligible items that you can spend for years and years and years. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people don't think about too, is like, today, you may not go to the doctor very often. You may be relatively healthy because you're still young, and it might just be you, or maybe it's just you and your young spouse and you're both in your peak health. But in 10 years or 20 years, you may not be. And once you contribute to an HSA, that money is your money. And I think that's one of the most important things to know, is that an HSA and an FSA are vastly different in that way. When you contribute to an FSA, which is a flexible spending account, that money is use it or lose it come December 31st. If you have not used your, and you usually have like a leeway period at the first couple months of the following year, but that's just to reimburse yourself. Your eligible expense needs to happen from January 1st to December 31st of the contribution year. And so once December 31st hits, you can't reimburse yourself, or you can't have a new expense for that. You can't have a new expense. And HSA is your money. And once it's in that account, nobody can take that away from you. Even if your employer made a contribution and you leave your employer the following day, that's still your money to keep. And I think that's another great thing about an HSA to keep in mind, is that it's not use it or lose it. It's there to stick with you for years and years and years to come. And you can do with it as you please. And you can invest it, or you can keep it in a cash account. But we highly suggest that you invest it if you can, if it makes sense for your situation, because that's really when it becomes an investment account and a growth account and a potential retirement account. And that's really what I intend to do with our HSAs. I mean, God forbid if something medically necessary happened and we had like super expensive, medical expenses, then we could always pull from that, which is a great thing. But if, as long as we maintain our health and stay relatively in good shape, then I plan to keep that invested as long as I can.
So I think that you underscored the really key part there in terms of using it as an investment account, which is the deferred reimbursement or the delayed reimbursement. So it's not that you won't recoup that money that you paid, but rather the reason why you're deferring it is because you want that money, those contributions that you're making and that your employer is potentially making, you want those contributions to have the benefit of compound interest, which you get through being invested over a period of time. So that makes absolute sense why, especially if somebody was trying to build their wealth more aggressively and they had an HSA as an option for them, it makes complete sense why somebody would want to maybe choose that in their scenario, which actually does take us to the next topic, which is, how would somebody with a high deductible plan and an HSA make that decision to go that route as opposed to opting for the PPO?
Right. So I think that's a really important distinction to make. And honestly, it's one that each person has to make individually. I wish I could sit here and give out some general scenarios and say, if you fall into this category, you can do this, in this category, you can do that. But really, it becomes a very personal decision, because we're not just talking about your financial circumstances. We're talking about your family circumstances. Is it just you? Is it you with just a spouse? Is it you, your spouse, and your child, or multiple children, or other dependents on your plan? So you have to consider all of those factors. Then you also have to consider your health status. What kind of health state are you in? Do you have any kind of ongoing medical issues that you have to go to the doctor for regularly, or take certain medications, or have certain procedures done for? So there are lots of considerations that come into play. And unfortunately, with each of those individual circumstances being so unique, you can't really kind of blanketly say an HSA or a high deductible healthcare plan is for everyone. And when we talk about HSAs, it's important to understand that the number one rule of an HSA is you have to have a high deductible healthcare plan first. And that's the thing you have to realize too. That's why when I put up that slide about, your out-of-pocket maximum, it's so important to understand what those numbers mean to you. That means that at your catastrophic worst situation, that's how much money you're paying. Like if God forbid something were to happen to us, one of us or whatever, my maximum out of pocket could potentially be $14,000. Now that doesn't mean that everybody who has a high deductible healthcare plan is going to pay $14,000 if you have a family plan. But it's saying that your plan to be a qualified plan for an HSA, that's your maximum out of pocket. Your maximum might be $6,000 or $7,000. It doesn't, that's the other thing. We don't know what your healthcare plan exactly is going to be because everybody's plan is slightly different. So that's the first thing is like, you really have to take your own personal circumstances into consideration. And then your health status and your financial status, because it might not be fiscally possible to participate in these types of plans. But let's assume that you've looked at it, you said, okay, I'm relatively healthy, my spouse is relatively healthy, or my child is healthy, and I'm doing okay, and I think this can work for me. The other thing to also think about is that you have to front the money. You have to front the money when you have these expenses. Now, a lot of people who typically have HSAs will just automatically reimburse themselves. Either it's kind of similar to an FSA. If you have one, you have a FSA card. It's kind of like a debit card, and you just take it to the pharmacy or the doctor's office or whatever, and you can just swipe it. HSAs will do something similar. So if you never want to touch your own money and just reimburse yourself directly with the HSA or pay directly with the HSA, you can do that too. But there's so many ways to kind of use this account. And so I kind of thought about this and I realized there's probably 3 typical types of people. Not to say that there aren't, variations of this, but I think there's generally 3 typical types of people who will participate in a high deductible healthcare plan plus an HSA. And the first one is a person who doesn't really use their health insurance very often. They maybe go once a year for their general checkup or whatnot, or maybe not even at all. And they just want to, have lower premiums, because that's also one of the other advantages of a high deductible healthcare plan is that they typically have lower premiums than a PPO. So let's say it's, $20 per paycheck for your high deductible health plan, but $38 per paycheck for your PPO. Then, if you don't go to the doctor that often, you're like, well, yeah, I'm just going to only pay $20 a paycheck because I don't, why am I going to spend more if I never even use my insurance? That makes sense. And so I understand that. And that's where sometimes people will participate in the high deductible healthcare plan portion of it, but they probably won't contribute much, if at all, to their HSA, maybe enough to get their employer match or just to make sure that their employer gives their contribution. Because also, like we said, if your employer just gives a direct contribution, that's still free money that you haven't even had to match. And it's available to you if something does come up. So if your employer is willing to contribute a few $100s, that's a few $100s that you don't have to spend if you do actually go to the doctor and have a copay or a deductible to pay. So the next type of person who would probably use a high deductible healthcare plan and an HSA is someone who goes to the doctor a few times a year, generally healthy, and has, manageable medical expenses. And when I say that, meaning that they're okay with either fronting the money or just saving enough to cover those expenses. And that's kind of where I was at first. Like neither me or my husband went very often to the doctor other than for our preventative care, and same for our son. None of us fortunately have like super expensive or long-term medical needs at this moment. Hopefully, hopefully we stay that way. But that's the thing where like I really was debating when I finally had the opportunity to have an HSA. And actually my husband was the one first who had the opportunity for an HSA and for a high deductible plan. And I really had to think about it. And I was like, well, we really don't go to the doctor too often, but you do have to consider, well, what if there's some kind of catastrophic event? Those are the kind of things that it's really hard to plan for. And honestly, it's almost impossible to plan for unless you just want to go to the max extreme for every situation. But generally for this second type of person, they go to the doctor every so often. They might have a few expenses throughout the year, maybe a few $100s, annually between them and their family or their dependents. But it's manageable. They could either choose to front the money or choose to reimburse themselves. And they typically will only contribute enough to their HSA to cover their expenses. So if they know they're only going to spend maybe $500 a year, they'll only contribute $500 to the HSA. But also keep in mind, like I said, once you contribute to the HSA, that's your money. And so long as you have an eligible medical expense to, quote, reimburse yourself with, you can pull that money out tax-free. And even once you're above a certain age, once you reach age 65, the money that's in your HSA account can basically be treated like a traditional IRA, which means that you can pull that money out and just pay your normal tax rate, whatever your tax income rate is at that time. That's what you'll pay on whatever you pull out. So even if, year after year, you're contributing amounts of money and you're not using as much as you're contributing, once you reach age 65, then you can just treat it like a normal retirement account, which is the other great part about an HSA.
So you don't actually have to use that money towards health expenses once you reach traditional
65.
retirement age.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that's an incredible benefit right
it
there.
really is. Yeah. I mean, it really does become a retirement account at that point, which is
Yeah.
great. And then the last kind of group of person, which is now who I am today, is a person who uses it purely as an investment account. They still have generally manageable healthcare expenses. They're not spending tens of thousands of dollars year after year on their healthcare, but maybe a few $100s, if maybe $1,000 or $2,000 a year. Even then, that's kind of a lot. But you never know what people's situation might be. But basically, they treat it as a future retirement account. So even though, like I said, you have to wait till age 65 to pull from it, beyond what you have enough to reimburse yourself with, you can still use that money tax-free. It lowers your healthcare premiums, it lowers your taxable income, and it gives you future tax-free income. And so we actually were joking about this today because I had a healthcare expense come up and I was complaining about how much money it was. But then I said, well, at least that's, future tax-free income for me. So that's the thing is I can save my receipt from today. And then in 20 years from now, I can reimburse myself with that and just have a few $100s of tax-free income. And the other awesome thing about that too, when you think about it, is when you apply for Medicare and for Social Security, all of your income tax comes into play into how much taxes you owe, what your premiums are, any fees beyond your eligible level and whatnot. And so you really do want to kind of keep your income level lower in retirement once you reach that 60 some odd plus age, 62, 63, 64, 65, whatever that age is. So an HSA helps that, where if this is not taxable income, this is tax-free income, it won't count against you when you are going to apply for these other things, like I said, like with Medicare and for Social Security. So there really are a lot of long-term things to think about when you apply for an HSA or when you contribute to an HSA. It's not just about your immediate healthcare expenses today, but it's the thinking about the future, the investment portion of it, the tax-free income portion of it, and the benefits that tax-free income can offer you in your future. There's so many advantages to it. Not to dismiss that, obviously, you have to pay for these expenses today. You have to be able to front that money today. It has to be, like I said, a manageable expense for you. If you can't afford $100 medical expense or even a $500 or $600 medical expense, then you might want to reconsider whether this is really for you. But if you have a healthy emergency savings, if you're able to front that money ahead of time and just basically sit on it, you pay that amount today, you pay that $600 today, but then you just wait 20 years while that money theoretically grows in your HSA and your investment portion of it, then it can really be a advantageous benefit to you for your future retirement.
Yeah. Yeah, I know in our situation, so my husband and myself, it's just the two of us. We don't have any kids or anything, but I have an HSA through my job and he's on my plan. And, he's had several surgeries over the past few years. We always joke about that I bought a lemon. And luckily his surgeries have been for either muscular or orthopedic issues. They haven't been for any kind of underlying disease or anything like that. So we're very fortunate in that case. But he has had, a lot of surgeries that we knew he was going to need to have. But actually last year, he was planning to have a surgery on his abdomen, a core muscle surgery, had been planning for this for several months. And then I think it was a week or two before he was supposed to go in for that surgery, we ended up having to take him to the emergency room for an emergency appendectomy. We didn't know at the time that his appendix had burst, but it was one of those situations. I was getting ready to go to work that morning and he was complaining about his stomach and pain in his back. And, we were like, should we go to urgent care or the emergency room? Ultimately,
it's a hard decision.
It is a hard decision. And ultimately we went to the ER and Obviously as somebody who's on the path to financial independence and who has an HSA with a high deductible plan as an option at my job, of course, I've considered this over the years. I think if it was just myself, it would be an easy decision for me to go with the HSA plan because I don't really go to the doctor that often other than like my preventative care. There have been a few times in the past where I've needed to go see a few specialists, just, something weird is going on. But generally speaking, I'm fortunately to be in quite good health. But because of my husband's history, I'm glad that we ended up going with the PPO for us because that would have been a lot of money out of pocket. I mean, the emergency room visit alone would have probably, blown my deductible then and there. And so I don't know if for us, if that would have been the right option, because of the cost savings, even the growth down the line. I mean, we would really, I'd really have to sit there and crunch the numbers to see what the trade-offs would have been. But I like having that assurance of the PPO, knowing that I've got the majority of my healthcare costs covered. But I totally see the appeal to an HSA, especially in like you said, in those three different scenarios. If you're in relatively good health, if you don't go to the doctor that often, and you can front load any medical expenses that do come your way, this could be a really good option for you. It could be not just a cost saving option, but a wealth building option for you.
Right.
So,
and that's kind of the thing is like, you made a good point is, so you're able to go back through your previous couple years of healthcare expenses and figure out if this would be right for you or not. And that's really the way to do it. And honestly, that's what I did. And while there's no way you could have predicted that his appendix was going to burst or he would need an appendectomy or whatever it might be, whatever it might be. You never know if you're going to get a car accident or sprain your ankle or whatever happens.
Right.
Obviously, a lot of us can't predict these kind of accidental things, but you can kind of go back through your general health and say, okay, how much did I pay last year and the previous year and the year, before that, for my out-of-pocket expenses? And that's the other thing to keep in mind is that while your premiums might be slightly lower with a high deductible healthcare plan, your out-of-pocket expenses are really what kind of matter. And you have to kind of do a little bit of like, special math, however you want to call it about it, because if you have a PPO, you're generally going to have fewer out-of-pocket expenses. That's the whole purpose of a PPO, is to have fewer out-of-pocket expenses, but your premiums are going to be slightly higher. So you have to kind of think, okay, would I pay more to go to my doctor for a non-preventative care visit, if a sick visit or, for, again, some random issue that comes up or some accident visit that you have to go for. You're going to have to pay your deductible probably. You're going to have to pay a copay. So you have to kind of put these things into consideration. But if you really haven't paid that much, you haven't gone to the doctor that often for the previous few years, you still are in generally the same, health that you were for those years, it's something that could work for you. And I'd really say that's the thing is it's important to run the numbers for yourself, run the numbers for not just you, but whoever else is going to be on your plan with you, your spouse, your kids, whoever it might be. Take all those amounts into consideration. And that's the kind of thing. And I think that's why a lot of people do tend to lean more towards the PPO too, is because it does take a little bit of legwork to really figure out if HSA and a high deductible healthcare plan is for you and will work for you. But if you can run the numbers and if you can figure out whether it really does work for you, it can be such an amazing opportunity and another benefit really through your employer. Like I said, if your employer is willing to give a contribution or a match, that's a great thing. And something I didn't mention was your employer contribution actually counts towards your total contribution. So unlike a 401k, like, your maximum contribution for a 401k is $19,500 for 2020. And if your employer decides to give you a $10,000, match or whatever your percentage might be, you can still contribute that $19,500 plus your employer $10,000. With a HSA, your employer contribution counts towards it. So for 2020, your family contribution is $7,100. If my employer decided to contribute $2,000 towards my HSA, I would only be allowed to contribute $5,100. Any amount beyond that, I would be taxed on and I would be penalized on. I would have to pay an additional penalty tax fee on top of that. So that's why you really want to make sure that you do those calculations, especially if it's you and a spouse and you both have two different plans. You can still do the family plan in that case, depending on what your situation is, but you really do have to kind of do the math and run the numbers and figure out who can contribute how much and, whose employer is doing what and really figure out the numbers for yourself.
And I hope this is a little bit of a personal question. You don't have to go into a ton of detail, but I'm curious to know, do you have a good sense of the breakdown of whether how much you've contributed to your HSA, or maybe how much your husband has contributed to his HSA has outweighed the how many healthcare expenses you had since you guys have started contributing to one?
Yeah, so because I keep a spreadsheet, of course I do, a list of everything that we've had since we started our HSA, because honestly, that's the way to do it. If you're gonna use it as an investment account, you have to keep track of your expenses.
Yeah,
So you
100%.
need, I create a OneDrive, create a Google Drive, whatever kind of cloud drive that you use, and just upload a soft copy there. And that way you don't have to keep paper expenses in a file or anything like that. But I also keep a spreadsheet that directs me to which one is like which receipt goes to which expense. And I have all that detailed information that I mentioned earlier about, date of service, what the expense was, who the doctor was, who it applied to, this and that. And since we've had HSA, so my husband started first a couple of years ago, and then last year my employer started offering a high deductible plan that was eligible with an HSA. And in total, we spent just under $3,000. So right now, if I wanted to, we could reimburse ourselves for that nearly $3,000 of expenses, and then do whatever we want with that $3,000. However, we have been able so far to front that money to, pay that. And that's over the course of a number of years. I think about 3 years now if we've had an HSA. And so over the past 3 years, we spent that amount of money out of pocket, and we've been able to front that. And I've left that money sitting in my account so that it can grow tax-free.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully, decades from now, or a decade from now, whatever it might be, it will have grown that much more. And now I can pull that $3,000 out as tax-free income. So let's say it's after the time that I've decided to retire, I can now, instead of pulling from IRA or my 401k or whatever, I can just pull from my HSA and have tax-free income, which is an amazing thing. So that's the thing, is like we've been fortunate enough to not have super major healthcare expenses over these past 3 years, but you have no idea what, the future holds. I have a young child, and kids like to injure themselves and do ridiculous things. And he's a boy, so God knows what have my, ahead of me. And that's the thing you kind of have to think about. But the other thing to consider too is that you do still want some kind of medical expenses. You want something to happen so that way you can pull that money out tax-free.
That's a good point.
Now, granted, we could wait until we're 65 and then start pulling it out. But if I decide to retire early or before age 65 or 62 or whatever, then I want to be able to pull that money out tax-free and have it available to me. And so you want to have some kind of medical expenses. Hopefully you're not hitting that out-of-pocket maximum each year, because that would just be super unfortunate. And at that point, you need to reconsider whether this is really for you or not. But if, you might have a one-off year, and unfortunately we never really know until it's, too late. Like, the thing is, we all have to make our open enrollment decisions now. And this is why we wanted to do this tonight and to talk about HSAs, because I've seen so many posts about, whether an HSA is right for someone and what are the details of it. They didn't really understand it. And so I really just want to try to clarify some of these basic things. Like we said, we have a whole plan, like part 2 of this, because I really wanted to get in some of the nitty gritty nuances of HSAs. There's so many things that I had to research on my own to really understand. Like, even I remember when I was signing up for it with my husband, when he started his HSA, I was sending so many questions to his benefits person. And I know they're probably like, who is this person asking me these questions? I don't know the answer.
Well, you know what, Steph, though, before, like, as you and I were prepping for this call, I kept saying this is going to be such a valuable episode of Winenance Wednesday, because people don't, like, even if you have a benefits administrator at your job who can tell you about these plans, they're not going to go into this level of depth.
They probably don't know, to be honest.
No, of course not. It's not their job to really know that, but it's the same thing with a 401k provider. It's that, your employer offers you this 401k and they kind of just put it on you to figure it out. Even your provider, they might offer some resources and you might even be able to call them for help, but they're not going to really walk you through and give you a crash course on a 401k, or in this case, an HSA. And that's what you've done for everybody tonight, is you've basically created a crash course on HSAs, but not just like reciting what they are, but you're giving real life scenarios and in which ways that people might want to actually take advantage of it. And something that I hadn't even thought about until you were talking about this tonight was that your contributions are essentially your premium, right? Like, but you're paying yourself instead of paying the insurance company a premium every month. And that's money that you never get to see again. You'll never, whether you use your insurance or not, you don't get to reap the benefits of that premium. You can think about your contributions to your HSA as like your own premium, but you get to reap the benefits of keeping that premium. You're paying yourself. So either way, you're spending that money on an insurance premium, so to speak, but I'd rather be the beneficiary of that premium versus giving it to, Blue Cross or whoever the case is.
Exactly. And I mean, I think it is important to clarify that you still do pay a
You
premium
do, yes.
for your insurance. So whether it's through
Yeah.
your employer or if you're self-insured or whatever, you're still paying a premium to your insurance, but
But
it's
it's lower.
cheaper. It's lower.
Yeah.
And that's like you said, is that if I'm going to pay $40 for a PPO or $20 for an HSA or for a high deductible plan, and then I'm going to put that additional $20 into my HSA, that $20 is my money. Whereas that PPO, that extra $20 is now to my insurance to never be seen again. I mean, in theory, if you're using your insurance a lot, then you're getting that money back through benefits and through services and usage. But if you have a PPO and you're never really going to the doctor, then it's far more worth it to consider getting a high deductible healthcare plan and then just contributing that HSA money. Because like we said, it's always your money. Once it's your money in the HSA, it's your money forever. And whether your employer put it in there or you put it in there, that is your money. If your employer puts the money in today and you quit your job tomorrow, that's still your money.
Right.
So
it is a great thing. So I know for me, it's open enrollment season. In fact, I have 2 more days to get my benefits in. And I know some people might have through the end of the year. So you have the challenge of the week, the Winenance challenge of the week. Do you want to talk to everybody about what the challenge is for this week?
Yeah, so hopefully, as you all have probably guessed by now, what we want to do is challenge everyone that if your employer is offering a high deductible healthcare plan with an HSA, just give it a consideration. Maybe that's what you've already been doing and you said, yep, I've been doing this for years and I'm going to keep doing it. Then awesome. Then keep doing it if it's right for you. But if you've been a little afraid to try it because you say, well, I don't know, what if something bad happens and, how can I do this? And what are the numbers for that? And I don't want to pay a ton out of pocket. Run the numbers. Really go back through your past, few years of medical expenses. You can go to your insured website and check out all your explanation of benefits, your EOBs, and see how much you've paid. Think about the medications that you're on. Are you paying copays on that? Or maybe you're not even on medications. I mean, that's the thing. Think about how frequently you're actually using your insurance and determine if signing up for a slightly cheaper plan, but with these additional benefits, is beneficial to you, or does it really make sense to stick with the PPO? So our challenge is to basically consider an HSA, consider what a high deductible healthcare plan and HSA can do for you. And if it makes sense for you, then, please don't be afraid to try it out. And that's the other thing too. I remember when we signed up for it, I was still a little nervous and afraid of it. And I said, you know what, we'll do it for 1 year. We can probably float 1 year. If something super catastrophic happens in this first year, then never again, I'm not going to do it. But the first year went by like that, like nothing. And I was like, you know what, we really didn't spend that much money. And then the second year went by and we still didn't spend that much money. And then the third year went by and knock on wood, we still haven't spent that much money. So that's the thing is like, it's just because you sign up for it 1 year doesn't mean that it's forever. Just so that you're in a financial situation that if that quote catastrophic case were to happen, you could hopefully handle it. Obviously, we don't want people going into debt just for healthcare. It's unfortunate that people in this country are having to deal with that in the first place. And that's certainly not what we want for anyone. So I always say, run the numbers, look at your personal circumstance, see if this applies for you and your dependents. And if it does, then just consider it.
That's really well said. This is a lot of information. And like we said, this is just sort of scratching the surface. We have a whole other episode that we're going to be doing in a few weeks about really how to take advantage of some of these hacks and lesser known things that people just don't really talk about with HSA. So think of that as like HSA, 201 if tonight was level 101. So I know we're kind of coming up on the hour. Steph, do you want to sort of reiterate that some of the topics that we've discussed tonight so people can start making those considerations?
Yes. So I know we've talked about a lot tonight and, I'm certain that no one's going to hold on to all of this information, but just to kind of give a quick summary about what we've talked about. So the first thing is that we want to read what an HSA is. An HSA is a triple tax advantage savings account for your healthcare expenses. So you get tax advantage in the middle while it's growing, and when you pull it out for healthcare expenses. So that's the first thing to understand. The next thing to understand is that you have to have a high deductible healthcare plan to be able to contribute to an HSA. So again, we've reiterated what that high deductible healthcare plan is and how that can impact what your out-of-pocket expenses are. So be sure you understand all the rules to have to be able to contribute to an HSA, but that's kind of the number one rule to understand and to know. The next thing is the contribution limits. So since we're nearing the end of 2020 and we're talking about the open enrollment season for 2021, I just wanted to kind of relay what the contribution limits are for 2021. So if you are an individual on your healthcare plan, it's just you, no spouse or dependents or anything, your maximum contribution for 2021 is $3,600. If it's you and at least one other person, whether it be a spouse or a child or whoever, then your family maximum contribution is $7,200. And then the next thing to understand and remember too is that your employer contributions do count towards your maximum limit. So if you do that $7,200 in 2021 and your employer wants to contribute $2,000, you can only contribute $5,200. So remember to do the math on that, because when you do your contributions, whether that be on your own or through your employer payroll, you want to make sure that you don't go over that limit, because you really don't want to be paying additional fees on money that you're already paying taxes on. And then the last thing, but hopefully not least, because we really wanted to make this clear to everyone, is always consider your personal situation and circumstances before signing up for a high deductible healthcare plan in HSA. For me, it really made sense. I ran the numbers. I said, you know what, I'm willing to give it a try for a year. And it worked for that first year, and it's worked for the years since then. But there might be a year in the future that it doesn't work for me. And at that point, I'll have to reconsider. But until then, I'm still open to doing an HSA and a high deductible healthcare plan. You always need to consider the circumstances for yourself and whoever else is going to be under this insurance with you. Run the numbers. I know it seems sometimes complex. It's really not. It's just going back through a little bit of information and writing down the values and kind of doing a comparison for you. And you know what, even before we started doing this, I had thought about something that we might be able to do, like a little worksheet or something to provide to people. And so hopefully, you know, if the spirit moves me, we'll be able to provide something for you guys. If it's not, you know, soon, then certainly hopefully by the time we do part 2, because I'm definitely super excited about that part 2 portion of it. Like I have so many notes and information and hacks that I had to do so much research on my own to try to figure out if this is really what it was. Cause like there's so many rules around it. I mean, anytime the IRS gets their hands on anything, it becomes way more complex than it needs to be. But that also means that there's loopholes and ways to get around things and ways to use it to your maximum advantage. And that's what I really want to teach everyone.
Well, all hail the queen of HSAs. Thank you so much for thank you for sharing this, obviously, with our audience and for allowing me to interview you on this. I know, you know, you were sharing a lot of personal information, and thank you for being so transparent and forthcoming with this, because I think this is really how people learn. You know, again, it's one thing to see, like, you know, an IRS webpage with a bunch of graphs and charts and, you know, limitations and stuff like that. But it's another thing to hear it from a person with a family who's taking advantage of it and how you're able to use it. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And then just closing out for tonight. So next week, you know, we do this every single week, every Wednesday at 8 p.m. live here on YouTube and Facebook. And so next Wednesday is the day after the national election. And I don't know about you all, but I feel like I'm going to need some wine regardless of the outcome.
We will be having more than our water.
Oh, it will not be a seltzer night that night. I mean, I will promise you all that. So we are going to do some sort of post-election conversation. You know, we're going to talk about sort of what this means for our investments, for personal finance, you know, just sort of our reflections on, you know, what what may come to be next Tuesday. And I'm sure we won't have any finality at that point either, but it's still a good time to talk about how policy does affect our financial lives. So hope you guys will tune in for next week's episode. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe on our YouTube channel so that other people can find this great content. And if you are considering an HSA, or if you know of somebody who might be considering an HSA, share this video with them. I mean, we really want to make this available for people so that they can consider all of the considerations rather, when they're choosing their insurance plan. This is really important information that you can't just get just anywhere. So we hope this was valuable to you rather. I know it was a really valuable conversation for us. And until next week, we'll see you guys later.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.